America's deadliest war cost the lives of around 750,000 men. But this was no ordinary war. These bloody battles were not fought on foreign soil. This was not one nation defending its territory against the threat of foreign invasion, but a domestic battle between two sides of the same coin. This was the American Civil War. Between 1861 and 1865, the United States was a country in conflict. Despite the familiar version of events taught in schools and colleges, the American Civil War, like life itself, was not black and white. It was more complex than the history books maintain. The North and South were political divides within the same piece of land. Both sides consisted of individuals with their own understanding, their own ideals, and their own belief in what they were actually fighting for. These were men and women with the same American blood in their veins, each trying to preserve a way of life they had been raised to accept since birth. But when the war arrived on their doorstep, they fought not just for freedom, but to survive. Welcome to Animata Historia, breathing life into historic photographs from around the world to remind us of how we used to live, where we came from, and what made us who we are today. In this episode, we are reanimating photographs of America's deadliest war, a conflict that divided a nation that was only just learning to walk. In 1861, at the very onset of the American Civil War, nearly 4 million people in the southern states were being used as slaves. It's hard to imagine today, but slavery was once woven into every corner of early America. Slavery still existed in the North too, but began to fade over time as new laws were slowly introduced. But in the South, it endured. It filled the cotton fields with forced labor. It built fortunes, shaped politics, and touched nearly every part of daily life. The country drew lines to mark the divide: slave states, where slavery remained lawful, and free states, where it did not. Yet even those lines blurred. 4 states, although remaining loyal to the Union, still held nearly 500,000 slaves in bondage. This fragile balance couldn't last. The divisions grew deeper, the questions more urgent, until the nation itself broke apart. Mathew Brady, the father of photojournalism. Before the moving picture and before television, there was Mathew Brady. Known as the father of American photojournalism, Brady and his team of photographers carried heavy cameras and fragile glass plates onto the battlefields of the Civil War. They risked their lives to capture what no artist's brush or writer's pen could truly convey: the raw, unfiltered reality of America's deadliest war. Outfitting wagons as mobile darkrooms, Brady and his team took their cameras onto the battlefields, dragging both horse and wagon through the muddy, rough terrain where no camera had ventured before. Risking gunfire and disease, they developed images on the spot, determined to show Americans the true face of war. His photographs stripped away illusion and changed how history would be remembered. Although Brady financed the project from his own pocket and gave it the structure and visibility it needed, it was the Scottish photographer Alexander Gardner who went into the field, producing the grim and unforgettable images that came to embody the conflict. While Brady's name was attached to the enterprise, it was Gardner's photographs, often published without credit, that carried its stark power. For years, his role was overlooked, his haunting work remembered, but his name largely unrecognized. It was Gardner, with the recently granted rank of honorary captain, who photographed the aftermath of America's bloodiest day at the Battle of Antietam. On September 19, 1862, 2 days after the battle, Gardner became the first of Brady's photographers to take images of the dead on the field. Unfortunately, Gardner's name was not mentioned in the review. But with time, black and white photographs became frozen relics, their details fading into the distance of history. Now, through the careful work of colorization and reanimation, these faces and places live again. The gray shadows of the past are restored to flesh and blood. Soldiers shift in their trenches. The battlefield is no longer silent. It breathes with the humanity of those who endured it. Brady once said, "The camera is the eye of history." And he was right. His photographs remain one of the most powerful testaments to the Civil War, a war that nearly tore the United States apart. By bringing these images back to life, we don't just study history, we feel it. We stand closer to the men, women, and children who lived through America's greatest trial. And in doing so, we honor their story, ensuring it is never forgotten. Chapter 1. The Nation Divides. Abraham Lincoln's election in 1860 set the stage for secession. Southern leaders saw him as a threat to slavery, even though he promised only to stop its expansion. His rise to the presidency became the spark that set the crisis in motion. In the North, slavery was fading out as it was no longer central to the economy, but in the South, it was expanding and seen as essential for survival. What was once a national institution became the focus of an entire conflict, one which centered on the South's dependence versus the North's growing opposition. In the early hours of April 12, 1861, thunder echoed across Charleston Harbor. Confederate guns opened fire on Fort Sumter, a Union stronghold guarding the bay. For 34 hours, shells rained down, lighting the sky and shaking the nation. No lives were lost in the bombardment, but its impact was profound. The attack on Fort Sumter marked the beginning of the American Civil War. Once war began, Lincoln faced the immense task of holding the Union together. Many doubted the nation could survive, but Lincoln refused to recognize secession as lawful, insisting the Union was perpetual. That unyielding stance kept the North committed through years of hardship. A boy, barely into his teens, stands beneath the shadow of a naval cannon. Too young to fight, but old enough to serve, his presence reminds us how deeply war affected every American family. In 1860, a year before the war began, David Dixon Porter stood at the edge of history. A career naval officer from a distinguished family, Porter's skill and determination would soon help shape the Union war effort at sea. From blockades to river campaigns, his leadership would prove vital in carrying the Union's power into Confederate waters. These early Union infantrymen, in parade dress of 1861, still carry the bright colors and confidence of a nation not yet tested. Within months, the shine of ceremony would fade into the mud and blood of America's deadliest war. Across the countryside, vast encampments of white tents stretched to the horizon. These makeshift cities housed tens of thousands of Union soldiers, waiting between marches and battles. Life here was a mix of drill, routine, and rest, a pause in the storm of war. For many, these camps became their world, where friendships were forged, letters were written, and the long wait of conflict was endured. When we imagine the war, we often think of the endless bloody battles, the fear and adrenaline of close combat and the bloodshed, the pain and the haunting screams of men in their final moments of life. But this gruesome reality only tells half of the story. The majority of the war years were spent waiting, long, unbearable months of nothing, followed by sudden bouts of absolute chaos and mayhem when the battle finally arrived. Two-thirds of soldiers lost their lives to disease during the war, with dysentery and typhoid fever the most common causes of death in camps with unclean water supplies and cooking pots. Life in camp was not only for the soldiers. Families followed regiments, setting up homes in canvas tents beside the men they loved. In scenes like this, the war feels closer, more human. Fathers in uniform, mothers working, children growing up in the shadow of battle. Children and young men were often assigned as drummers, their task to carry the rhythm of battle. The beat of the drum signaled orders, rallied morale, and gave structure to marching columns. This image shows how even the youngest were swept into the tide of war, their faces carrying a mix of pride and innocence. They would witness the chaos of combat long before reaching adulthood. Chapter 2: Antietam, Fredericksburg, and Early Bloodshed. Here, the soldiers of the 170th New York Infantry pause before battle. Their uniforms are still clean, their expressions calm, and their posture relaxed. They could not yet know how the coming years would harden them. Many of these men would see battles that scarred the land and themselves alike, carrying memories that would never fade. Artillery pieces like these were the most devastating weapons of their age. The Union's cannons outside Yorktown were capable of flattening defenses, tearing apart lines of men, and changing the shape of battle at any given moment. It is a reminder that technology was already reshaping warfare into something more mechanized and more deadly. Dead Confederate soldiers lay fallen following the Battle of Antietam, which began in Sharpsburg, Maryland on September 17, 1862. This particularly bloody clash produced more than 15,000 casualties in the first 8 hours of fighting alone. A farm lane cutting through the battlefield seen here was called Bloody Lane. This was the bloodiest single day in American history, which saw a staggering toll of 23,000 Union and Confederate soldiers killed, wounded, or missing in just 24 hours. Upon hearing the devastating news, Lincoln immediately came to the battlefield himself. Standing with General McClernand and Allen Pinkerton, he saw the price of war with his own eyes: the loss, the grief, and the immense burden of preserving the Union. Disguised as E.J. Allen, Pinkerton inspects the fields of Maryland. His intelligence work operated in the shadows, crucial but often unseen. Lincoln confronts General McClellan inside his tent. The president wanted action after the terrible loss of so many men, and between them lay the Union's fate. But the general offered only hesitation. After Antietam, Lincoln pressed his generals to strike again, hoping to bring the war to a swift end. But at Fredericksburg that December, his hopes shattered. Along the sunken road, Union soldiers fell in waves, the ground itself becoming a tomb. It was one of the war's darkest hours. Union engineers study the shattered railroad bridge. Rails cut short, trestles splintered, mills silent behind them. A reminder that in this war the lifelines of a city could be broken in a night. Chapter 3: The Battle of Gettysburg. In July 1863, the fields of Gettysburg became the bloodiest battlefield in American history. For 3 days, Union and Confederate armies collided, leaving over 50,000 dead, wounded, or missing. Gettysburg was more than a battle. It was the turning point. The Union's victory halted Lee's advance and gave Lincoln the ground to speak of a new birth of freedom. Here, the very fate of the nation hung in the balance. General Thomas "Stonewall" Jackson, in gray Confederate uniform, stares with piercing intensity. His discipline and daring maneuvers made him the South's most feared commander. His death in May 1863 deprived the Confederacy of its sharpest blade. Amid the aftermath, artist Alfred Waud balances on the rocks, sketchbook in hand. His drawings captured what cameras could not: movement, chaos, and the spirit of battle. At Gettysburg in July 1863, Robert E. Lee risked everything. For 3 days, his army struck hard, but Union lines held. On the 3rd day, he ordered Pickett's charge, a bold assault across open ground that ended in disaster. Defeated, Lee admitted, "It is all my fault." Gettysburg marked the high tide of the Confederacy and the beginning of its decline. General Robert E. Lee's trusted lieutenant, James Longstreet, commanded with grim determination. Yet even his skill could not reverse the tide. From this point forward, the Confederacy would fight a war increasingly on the defensive. Pickett helped lead the infamous Pickett's Charge that ended with Confederate defeat, turning the tide of the battle and the war against the South. Meade was only given the command of the Army of the Potomac 3 days before the Battle of Gettysburg, and didn't arrive at the battle until the end of the first day, after which time he was able to organize the Union's victory over the next 2 days. In 1863, at just 23 years old, George Armstrong Custer was promoted to brigadier general. At Gettysburg, he led Union cavalry into fierce combat against J.E.B. Stuart's horsemen. Reckless, bold, and fearless, Custer's charge helped blunt the Confederate cavalry, marking the arrival of a rising, if controversial, star of war. While rising figures like Custer gained fame and notoriety, the true face of war was found here, in the silence of the landscape, where young men lay buried far from home. The cost of Gettysburg was heavy, and fields once filled with wheat and fences now became graves, as the war's grim harvest spread across the land. On July 5, 1863, photographer Alexander Gardner and his assistant, Timothy O'Sullivan, arrived at the site of the Battle of Gettysburg. The battle had ended 2 days earlier. On parts of the battlefield, bodies were still unburied. Over the next 3 days, Gardner did not hesitate to photograph the carnage. On July 6th, when he saw the body of a Confederate soldier in an area called Devil's Den, he photographed it. He and O'Sullivan then saw an opportunity for another, more dramatic photograph. They moved the corpse more than 40 yards to what they believed to have been the sharpshooter's position, and O'Sullivan made another exposure. Gardner was known to have arranged some of the dead to create even more dramatic compositions, and it has been noted by some historians that a particular rifle had been included in a number of these photos as a prop. This was not a financial motive, however. He simply wanted to create the maximum impact for each and every shot. And morally right or not, his images certainly have an impact on all who view them. Amid the fields strewn with the fallen, one story stood apart. John L. Burns, a 69-year-old veteran of the War of 1812, picked up his musket and marched into the fight at Gettysburg. Wounded 3 times, he survived to become a living symbol of courage, a stark contrast to the countless young men who never left the field. As the guns fell silent at Gettysburg, thousands were left wounded, captured, or dead. Among them were these Confederate prisoners, photographed against a makeshift fence line. Weary and uncertain of their fate, they were part of the more than 4,000 Confederates taken into Union custody after the battle. A reminder that for survivors on either side, the road ahead was still long and brutal. While captured Confederates faced an uncertain future, Union officers of the 93rd New York settled into their camp life in Virginia. Here, in the summer of 1863, they sit for a meal beneath the shade, their tent draped with the flag. The image offers a rare glimpse of the quieter moments of war, when the guns fell silent and soldiers gathered around bread, coffee, and comradeship. Behind the lines, war depended on a vast system of supply. Here an officer poses among crates of hardtack, the Army's staple ration. Tough, tasteless, and often infested, it sustained soldiers through long marches and bloody battles. The Union's ability to feed and equip its armies would prove as decisive as any general on the field. Among the most respected Union commanders was Major General John Sedgwick, steady, dependable, and beloved by his men. At Gettysburg, his 6th Corps marched hard to reach the field, a reminder of how critical both endurance and command were in deciding the battle's outcome. Chapter 4. The Bloody Year. 1864 is often called the bloodiest year of the Civil War because of the scale and intensity of fighting as the conflict entered its final phase. Relentless campaigns, fought with no pause and at unimaginable cost, pushed the conflict toward its conclusion. At the center of it all stood Ulysses S. Grant, the general who refused to turn back. Grant's portrait shows a man plain in appearance but relentless in resolve. Unlike other generals, he pressed forward without hesitation, grinding the Confederacy down through sheer persistence. His steady eyes reveal the determination that would eventually win the war. And 5 years later, in the March of 1869, he went on to become the 18th President of the United States. Grant sits with his generals beneath the trees, mapping the drive on Petersburg, a war of trenches and attrition, where every line drawn meant lives weighed against the fate of the Union. The siege of Petersburg began in June 1864. Here the war became a siege. Men burrowed into trenches, enduring months of mud, fire, and fear. It was a slow struggle that tested the will of both armies and the nation itself. The siege of Petersburg began in June 1864. Here the war became a siege. Men burrowed into trenches, enduring months of mud, fire, and fear. It was a slow struggle that tested the will of both armies and the nation itself. It lasted until April 1865, nearly 10 months, ending with Lee's retreat and the fall of Richmond. Captured in stillness, Sherman looks sharp and restless. His eyes betray the intensity of a man who believed in total war, not just defeating armies, but shattering the enemy's ability to fight. Sherman sits upright in the saddle, his expression stern. He would lead the infamous March to the Sea, cutting a path of destruction through Georgia. His strategy broke the South's will as much as its armies. While Sherman pressed his march in the West, here at Petersburg Union, engineers labored in the pine woods of Virginia. Company C rests beside their wagons in August 1864, weary but essential, building the trenches and fortifications that slowly strangled the Confederacy. Not far from the trenches where the engineers toiled, Union artillerymen unveiled their most formidable weapon, the 13-inch mortar known as the Dictator. Mounted on a railroad flat car outside Petersburg in October 1864, it symbolized the growing power of Union siege warfare, a massive gun capable of hurling shells deep into Confederate lines. But behind the thunder of the great guns lay the war's quiet aftermath. At Cold Harbor in 1864, soldiers were sent to collect the scattered bones of the fallen, grim work that showed how battlefields lingered long after the fighting ceased. Yet even in the shadow of war, moments of distraction broke through. At General Wilcox's headquarters outside Petersburg in 1864, officers and soldiers gathered to watch a cockfight, a brief escape from the siege, where laughter and wagers tried to mask the grim reality waiting beyond the camp. Elsewhere in Petersburg, officers of the 114th Pennsylvania passed the hours with cards outside their tents. For a moment the war receded, replaced by the simple rituals of camp life, smoke, laughter, and the shuffle of worn decks against canvas tables. African-American Union soldiers stood watch along the canal works. Recruited into the U.S. colored troops, these men labored and fought under constant fire, their presence a living testament that the war for Union had become a war for freedom. Chapter 5. Collapse and Aftermath. By April 1865, after months of siege, Petersburg fell. Lee's army fled west, but at Appomattox, surrounded and exhausted, he surrendered. The Confederacy was collapsing, and the war neared its end. In the days that followed, Lee returned home, no longer the commander of an army. He was simply a man, carrying the quiet weight of defeat. In Richmond, 1865, Robert E. Lee stood in defeat, his uniform worn, his face marked by loss. The image captures not triumph, but the heavy aftermath of surrender. Soon after Lee's surrender at Appomattox, Confederate soldiers stacked their arms in silence. The long war was over. Muskets leaned together in neat pyramids, the last act of obedience to a cause now lost. With that gesture, an army dissolved, and a nation began the hard task of healing. In the spring of 1865, southern cities lay in ruins. Richmond burned as Confederate forces fled, and Charleston, cradle of secession, was reduced to ashes. The war had scarred not only the land, but its people. Here in Richmond, the proud capital of the Confederacy, nothing remained but rubble and fire-scorched walls. Amid the ruins, piles of unused cannonballs stood as silent witnesses to a cause that had collapsed in smoke. And farther south in Charleston, the Mills House still stood, but all around it lay ruins. The city that had fired the first shots of war now bore the scars of its fiery end. On April 14, 1865, a mere 5 days after Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, tragedy struck. In the very city he had fought so diligently to protect, Abraham Lincoln was shot at Ford's Theater. These final portraits show a weary leader, unaware his time was nearly over. He had carried the Union to triumph, ended the curse of slavery, and in his death left a legacy that would endure for generations. But Lincoln's death was not in vain. If we look at America today, we see a land of opportunity, a country unified by morality and the desire to be better. We live in a time where equality on all levels continues to be an area in which we can all improve upon. We may not have reached the pinnacle of civilization just yet, far from it, but as a species we still thrive for the same peace and union that our ancestors gave their lives to attain. These were the images of America's deadliest war, a barbaric and tragic moment in history which could have seen the end of the United States as a civilized nation. But somehow, through all the heartache and bloodshed, many of those differences have now been resolved. Let us learn from our mistakes and swear never to repeat them, and step out of the shadows of history and into the light of a better world.